What's up guys, before we get into the ranking, let me briefly explain the archetypes I'll be going over. From most to least bulky, I'll be ranking how hard it is to play the main 7 archetypes. Stall, semi-stall, bulky balance, balance, bulky offense, and hyper offense. Stall is the bulkiest archetype and revolves around winning by entry hazards, status conditions, and weak moves, typically without having a single breaker or fast Pokemon. Stall teams tend to generate long games and often focus completely on defense without any breaking plan beyond gradual chip damage. Semi-stall, despite having stall in the name, actually functions very differently. Semi-stall teams use 4 or 5 bulky Pokemon not to prolong the game and win with residual chip damage, but rather to enable 1 or 2 more offensive, powerful Pokemon and give them safe entry opportunities to break. Bulky balance teams function similarly to semi-stall teams, but simply have 3 or 4 bulky Pokemon instead of 4 or 5. Balanced teams are exactly what you'd expect. Balanced. They tend to have at least 2 bulkier Pokemon and at least 2 more offensive Pokemon, and they can have very slow or very fast games depending on the matchup. Bulky offense and offense both utilize a small and often not long-lasting defensive core of usually just 2 Pokemon. The other 4 are offensively inclined Pokemon. Both teams are incapable of surviving long-term and rather focus on breaking before they are broken. Bulky offense teams aim to get off strong attacks by using Pokemon with high HP and defense stats, whereas offense teams tend to get off strong attacks by using Pokemon with high speed stats. Lastly, hyper offense teams usually have 1 dedicated lead to set hazards or screens, 4 to 5 sweepers, and sometimes an additional support Pokemon. Hyper offense teams are notably the only playstyle where sacking Pokemon is part of the regular game plan. You rarely want to switch, and usually it's the right play to leave a sweeper in and keep attacking until it's dead, following a safe switch with the next sweeper. When I rank these archetypes for difficulty, I will be assuming they are played at a high or top level. Usually the difficulty is about the same at all levels, but there are some exceptions. For example, one of the most difficult archetypes for newer players is bulky hazard stack because they often struggle with when to stack hazards and when to go on the offensive. This isn't nearly as difficult for higher level players, where bulky hazard stack is often considered among the easiest archetypes. There is also variation of difficulty within archetypes. For example, some styles of hyper offense are harder to play than others. I consider screens to be more difficult to play than traditional Glamora lead 5 sweepers hyper offense. There are undoubtedly teams of every archetype that are extremely difficult to pilot properly. However, I'm not going to be rating these playstyles specifically, I'm just going to talk about the overall archetype in general. I know there are exceptions. The examples I'll be using in this video will be from SVOU, but I'd say my opinion of how difficult these archetypes are to play is fairly consistent, at least across recent generations. The last thing that I want to mention before I begin is that this is not a criticism of any of these archetypes. Pokemon is an incredibly complicated game, and it takes a lot of skill and knowledge to win, even with the easiest archetypes. Just because it may be the easiest, that doesn't mean it's easy. Without further ado, let's get right into it. The easiest archetype of all to play is Stall. Stall is widely regarded as the most matchup-dependent archetype, and this perception is well earned. Stall teams' complete lack of offensive power leads to the most formulaic and simple game plan of any archetype. Basically, you try to use status moves, knockoff, and hazards as much as possible, and when something threatening is on the field, switch into the Pokemon that walls it. There's a bit more to it than this. In difficult matchups, Stall teams tend to have a very difficult time. More offensive archetypes are more likely to successfully navigate bad matchups, but the passive nature of Stall teams leaves little room to maneuver. This means you might have to make some hard reads and guess when your opponent will bring in a certain threatening breaker, or risk one of your walls getting KO'd in order to use a crucial attack on a switch. The best Stall players know when to play aggressively. That being said, just because Stall teams are less likely to navigate bad matchups, that doesn't mean it's harder to navigate bad matchups. Having a team of only walls makes everything simpler and removes a lot of components that most archetypes have to worry about. Outplaying a bad matchup with a Stall team almost always consists of guessing what move a threatening breaker will use and or trying to snipe a breaker upon switch-in. Other archetypes have to do this and more when trying to outplay a bad matchup. One of the most difficult aspects of Pokemon is knowing when to play defensively and react to your opponent's moves, and when to be more aggressive and pressure your opponent. Choosing to do either of these things at the wrong time can mean a loss. Stall players almost never have to make this decision. Playing reactively is almost all Stall does, and it's generally considered to be easier than playing aggressively, an assessment I agree with. Some players will argue that Stall is hard to play because it's bad, and this is true. Stall is definitely suffering in SV. Still, I don't consider an archetype being bad the same as being hard to play, it just means you'll have a worse matchup spread. One thing that should be mentioned though is that Stall takes more patience to play than any other archetype. Stall games often go for hundreds of turns, and if you're facing a bad matchup, you're going to have to stay sharp the whole time. So, credit to it, that does make it a bit more difficult. The next archetype is nearly as easy as Stall, and I considered switching their places on this list. It's Hyper Offense, or HO for short. Despite being on completely opposite ends of the spectrum, Stall and HO are easy for a lot of the same reasons. Much like Stall, playing Hyper Offense removes a lot of aspects of the game and a lot of thinking that other archetypes have to do. You rarely have to worry about whether to play defensively or aggressively. With HO, the answer is always to play aggressively. There's no other choice. HO is made even easier by the common presence of dedicated leads. Most archetypes have to carefully consider their lead. HO teams have very strong leads like Glamora and Rabombi, which work almost every time. After that, the game plan is usually the same. Go into whatever setup sweeper can set up on whatever the opponent has out, click a setup move, attack until the sweeper dies, and do this again until you win or lose. Of course, there is more to it than this. You need to consider how much to set up. What sequence of sweepers will optimize your win chances. Furthermore, the best Hyper Offense players actually know when to play defensively. This is rare, but sometimes Hyper Offense teams would rather save a sweeper or lead with something different than the common suicide lead, and knowing when to preserve something or when to play the team a bit differently can be difficult. That being said, much like Stall, playing HO still removes a lot of the mental load that other archetypes have. It should also be mentioned that HO is the archetype that is most forgiving to mistakes. You can sack an entire Pokemon for absolutely no reason and still have a solid shot to win the game. Given that HO has very little defensive team structure and is more so a group of sweepers that loosely support one another, losing a Pokemon isn't nearly as big of a deal. This makes HO very popular among newer players since their mistakes won't be punished nearly as hard as if they played bulkier teams. If you sack a Pokemon accidentally with a Stall team or any other archetype, you probably lost the game. At a high and top level, Stall is easier than Hyper Offense, but at a low and medium level, Hyper Offense is without a doubt the easiest archetype. Before we continue, it should be noted that all other archetypes besides Stall and HO are noticeably more difficult to play. Those two definitely stand out as the two easiest, since both remove significant components of playing and thinking that are often associated with competitive Pokemon. With that in mind, the next easiest is Semi-Stall. Semi-Stall teams are easy for a lot of the same reasons as Stall, just not as much. Semi-Stall teams can afford to play quite reactively and can win a fair amount of matchups just by switching walls into the Pokemon they're meant to stop. However, Semi-Stall teams give up a bulky slot or two in favor of using one or two breakers or progress makers. This means that the team will be able to play reactively in fewer matchups than Stall can, and so the Semi-Stall player will often have to consider offensive pressure and play to position their one or two progress-making Pokemon. As you might expect, next up is Bulky Balance. The lines between Bulky Balance and Semi-Stall are quite blurry, as these two archetypes function in practically the same way. Still, Bulky Balance is more difficult to play, as it is by definition more offensive than Semi-Stall. This means Bulky Balance will have fewer matchups where it can just keep switching walls into the Pokemon they're meant for. More offensive Pokemon to position means balancing more offensive and defensive playing. Now, before we get into the top 3 hardest archetypes, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you're enjoying the video. Also, if you're interested in Pokemon coaching, I offer tutoring and you can find the link in the description. The next archetype on the ranking is Balance. Balance teams, as the name implies, have a balance between defensive and offensive playing in most matchups. When playing against more offensive teams, you'll need to play aggressively enough to break before your team is broken. When facing bulkier teams, you'll need to be patient and utilize your walls to play the long game. Great balance players have to master how to play both drawn-out games and faster, more aggressive games. The reason balance isn't considered harder than bulky offense or offense, the two remaining archetypes, is that balance still has walls to fall back on in a tough spot. Bulky offense and offense don't have the luxury of a solid defensive core that balance does, meaning mistakes are punished harder for these two archetypes, and offensive playing, which I consider to be generally more difficult than defensive playing, is a requirement, not an option. Still, I believe that playing balance requires a more broad skill set than any other archetype. No other archetype can play like an offense one game and a semi-stall the next. The best balance players are flexible and understand when to play one way or the other. Next up is bulky offense. Both bulky offense and offense have temporary defensive cores, not meant for a drawn-out game. They often lack recovery moves or solid walls, and their goal is to break your team before you can break theirs. These two archetypes are very similar, and the lines between the two are quite blurry. The main difference between bulky offense and offense is that bulky offense teams, as the name would imply, use high defense stats and HP, often with defensive investment or HP investment, to get off strong attacks. The idea is that they can tank enough hits and hit hard back enough that they'll be the ones left standing. Offense, on the other hand, utilizes speed rather than bulk to get off strong hits. Generally, the more frail your team is, the more one bad turn can hurt you. This is why I consider bulky offense slightly easier to play than offense. Lastly, the only archetype left, and the most difficult archetype in my opinion, offense. Offense teams are full of fast and frail Pokemon, but unlike Hyper Offense, you can't just sack them to transition between Pokemon. Most offense teams have some type of defensive core, but it never lasts long. Where a stall team might have a Dondozo or a Gliscor, an offense team's main defensive wall might be a speed-invested Great Tusk with a Rocky Helmet. This is the least forgiving archetype for mistakes. Leaving a Pokemon in when you shouldn't, or going for a risky switch that doesn't work out, will usually lead to a death. Often I advise my clients to practice on ladder using offense teams because it makes their mistakes much more clear to them. Hyper Offense and Stall can hide mistakes and mitigate your weaknesses as a player, but an offense team will show your weaknesses clearly and punish you for them hard. If you never play offense teams, I'd highly recommend giving it a try. It's great training. Let me know in the comments if you agree with my rankings and why or why not. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.